Hello, my name is Vicky Lam and I'm a publishing editor with Elsevier Health Sciences in Asia Pacific. This talk on the construction of an article is geared towards answering this question: how do I build up my article properly? Manuscripts contain many sections and each one has a definite purpose. At the beginning of an article are the title, abstract and keywords, and these play important roles in terms of allowing the article to be easily found, indexed and conveniently advertised to potential readers. The main text of the article is summarized by the IMRAD acronym, which stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. This is where you must present your work and convey the main messages and findings effectively. The last grouping of sections brings up the end of the manuscript, the conclusion, acknowledgements, conflicts of interest, and supplementary and supporting materials. Okay, so even though the article is presented in its final form in this structure, you will find that it is often better to write the manuscript according to a different order that allows you to develop your core messages first, i.e., data in the form of figures and tables, followed by the methods, results, and discussion. Then the conclusion, introduction, abstract and keywords, and finally the article title. For simplicity's sake, I will go through each section of a manuscript according to the order on the previous slide rather than to this order in which you would actually write the sections. The purpose of the article title is to tell readers what your paper is all about. Your title may be the only part of your paper that gets read, first by the journal editor and then by your readers, so make every word count. There are certain characteristics of strong article titles. They attract the reader's attention. And remember that readers are the potential authors who will cite your article. They are specific and directly reflect the content of the manuscript. They are informative but concise. They do not use technical jargon and abbreviations, and it is best to use formal language. It is also advisable to discuss your title with your co-authors. Finally, do note that editors and reviewers do not like titles that make no sense or that fail to represent the content of the manuscript adequately. Here are some examples of actual titles that have been received and then revised after the editor's comments. For the listing of author names in the author byline, there are some general principles you can follow. The first author is usually the person who conducted and supervised the data generation and analysis, as well as the proper presentation and interpretation of the results, putting the paper together and submitting it to the journal. The corresponding author can either be the first author or a senior author from the institution, especially if the first author is a PhD student or a postdoc who will move to another institution soon. Some common problems with author names you should pay attention to are wrong spelling, especially of co-author names, different spellings of the same name from manuscript to manuscript, and especially for Asian names, not being clear which is the surname or family name. Watch out for these common problems and be accurate and consistent in how you spell out author names, because if the manuscript is accepted and published with the wrong spelling of author names, it will go into the published record and it can be difficult to rectify. This will of course have repercussions for the affected author. For example, articles they wrote not being attributable to them, because when you type in the name in a database to search for their articles, the article is listed under a wrongly spelled name. This will of course directly impact that author's H index. After the article title, the abstract is the second most read portion of your paper. Some editors will use the quality of the abstract as a measure of whether a paper even merits peer review. The purpose of the abstract is to tell readers what you did and the important findings. Depending on the journal's requirements, the abstract should be structured into subsections with subsection headings, or just be in one single paragraph with no subsection headings. Again, check the Guide for Authors for the specific instructions. The abstract should concisely summarize the problem, the methods employed, the results, and the conclusion. To help editors and reviewers understand the original contribution of your study and therefore want to publish your manuscript, you need to clearly indicate the context and rationale for your study in the background section of the abstract. There should also be a precise statement of purpose, because without it, the editor and reviewer will have trouble understanding why you did your study and assessing whether you accomplished anything worthwhile. Make sure you haven't substituted simple background information for a clear statement of purpose. Your abstract must also contain an explicit statement of your main conclusion. Don't leave it up to the editor and reviewers to infer what the conclusion is. The abstract acts as an advertisement for your article because it is freely available via search and indexing, so you want to make it as catchy and impactful as possible. An abstract that is written clearly will strongly encourage the reader to read the rest of your paper. As already mentioned, it may be best to write the abstract almost last so that it accurately reflects the content of your paper. An example of a structured abstract is given here from The Lancet. It is clearly laid out and details why the study was done, how it was done, what was found, and the conclusion. Make it interesting and concise but complete so that it is easy for readers to understand without having to read the rest of the article. An example of an unstructured abstract from the journal Pain is given here. While it is not divided into subsections, it still contains all of the essential information required, i.e., why the study was done, how it was done, what was found, and the conclusion. Avoid using technical jargon and abbreviations if possible. If you do need to use abbreviations, spell them out in full the first time they appear. Some journals will ask for a graphical abstract in addition to the traditional text abstract, and this will be published online only. This is more common in science and technology journals than in health science journals. Some journals will also ask you to provide the highlights for online publication. These are basically the main messages of your article boiled down to 3 or 4 key points. Keywords are used by abstracting and indexing services to label or tag your article so that they can categorize your article for their database. The keywords you select will determine whether your article is found by potential readers or not, so avoid making them too general or too narrow. If you're going to use abbreviations, make sure that they are firmly established in the field of study. PubMed's medical subject headings page has some suggestions for authors on how to select appropriate mesh terms as keywords. The benefit of using mesh terms is that your abstract is more likely to appear in any given search and thus be read and cited by others. The introduction is used to provide context for your manuscript and convince readers why your work is useful for advancing that particular field of study. Be brief. 2 to 3 paragraphs is sufficient. Introductions of letters and short communications are even shorter. You should include only the key, most relevant and authoritative literature that provides specific context for your study. Focus on the current state of knowledge in the field. Introduce the main scientific publications on which your work is based. Cite a couple of original and important works, including recent review articles. If possible, include references to authors who like your papers, or to authors you have met at conferences, as the editor often chooses reviewers from the references mentioned in the introduction or the references section of a paper. So these people are quite likely to become your referees. Be aware that editors do not like too many citations to references that are irrelevant to your study or to inappropriate judgments on your own achievements in the introduction section. The introduction should clearly demonstrate the significance of your study as you address the following. What is the problem you are trying to solve? Are there any existing solutions? What is the best solution? And what is that solution's limitations? You should end with a clear statement of the objectives of your study. This purpose statement is essential to the focus of your whole paper. Anything peripheral or irrelevant to your purpose statement should be omitted. Watch out for the following: using more words than necessary, and mixing your results, discussion, conclusion, or data into the introduction. Always keep them separate to ensure that the manuscript flows logically from one section to the next. It is best to avoid expressions such as novel, first time, first ever, and paradigm changing unless you are certain that your work are those things. The methods section describes how you studied the problem. This is the most important section of your whole manuscript. Many editors will read this section first to determine if the experimental methods employed are sound, robust, and ethical. They will not bother to read the rest of the manuscript if the methods employed fail on any of these points. Here is where you need to be detailed. You must include all of the selection criteria, both inclusion and exclusion, that you used to determine the eligibility of subjects for your study. These details will help readers understand whether your sample is appropriate and to which groups your results and conclusions may be generalized. Reproducibility is the cornerstone of good science. The principle to follow here is that the methods, including the methods of data analysis, are described in enough detail so that another expert in your field could reproduce the experiment and replicate your results. No result should appear in the results section without a corresponding description of the method that yielded it in the methods section. For most health science journals, you will also need to provide information on patient consent and IRB and ethics board approvals. Of course, there is no need to describe previously published procedures. You can simply direct readers to the relevant reference instead. It is important that you clearly identify the equipment and materials used in your experiment, giving also the trade name, model number, and the manufacturer's name, as in this example shown on the slide. The first portion of the results, after the description of the sample population's characteristics, if yours is a clinical study, should provide the overall factual answer to the question implied in your purpose statement. Present results that are essential to the discussion later on, organized in a logical manner. Use subheadings as appropriate. You have three basic choices: organization by chronology or type, from the most to least important, or in the same order as that in the methods. Be sure to say how comparable your groups were, and don't give results to a greater degree of accuracy than the tool of measurement was capable of. Also, don't leave out any unexpected results. Only data of primary importance should be shared in this section. You can use the supporting or supplementary material section for data of secondary importance. In the results section, stick to the facts only. Present the factual trends and reserve all discussion of their meaning and significance for your discussion section. You should present your results in one place only, so choose whether that will be in the text, table, or figure. If you can summarize the information in a few sentences, then the text is the most appropriate place to report your findings. If precision is important, or you have lots of data, then a table is the best method of presentation. If the relationships or trends in the data are important, then a figure would be more appropriate. The written part of the results that refers to the findings presented in tables and figures should not repeat that information. Rather, this text should help the reader see and understand the main factual trends and relationships in the data presented in the tables and figures. If you're using tables and figures, be sure that you follow the guide for authors as closely as possible. I also recommend that you look at previous issues of the journal so that you can follow the journal style as closely as possible. Tables and figures should have a concise legend that can stand on its own. In other words, readers should be able to understand what the visual is depicting without having to refer to the other parts of the manuscript. A final point to note is that busy editors may scan your tables and figures before deciding whether to read the full text or not, so make it easy to interpret by having your visuals as high quality as possible. We will now go into more detail about tables. Tables are useful for presenting a lot of data in a small amount of space. They are great for emphasizing and supporting direct comparisons between groups or items, and they show the reader the actual data. In short, they allow readers very easy access to your data. Never submit your table as an image file. It should always be in text format so that your paper, if it is accepted, the typesetter does not need to retype your table, because if they need to retype it, they would introduce errors into it. So make sure that you submit your table as a text format. Here's an example of a poor depiction of a lot of data. The table is so long that it has to be spread over multiple pages, and there are too many abbreviations for the reader to memorize. We commonly see tables like this, and we will usually ask authors to rework it into several shorter tables if possible. Here's an example of a good table. It's not too crowded or too long, and because we read tables by scanning, it's easy for the reader to find what they're looking for. The column and row headings should be as brief as possible, with the important details kept in the table footnotes. The table heading concisely describes what the table is about. A good table should draw the reader's attention to the rest of the paper. Now, unlike tables, figures, such as charts and graphs, are better used to draw attention to high-impact information, like trends, patterns, and relationships between groups. They can depict complex results and allow readers to extrapolate what the data suggests. Figures can add credibility to your data. As humans, we tend to believe what we see more than what we read. Again, figures are useful for drawing in the reader, but should not be inserted simply for decoration. Try to avoid color if possible, as journals will usually charge you to print in color. If different line styles can clarify the meaning, never use color or other effects such as 3D, as these tend to distort the data. The purpose of a figure is to make your data as easy to interpret as possible and not to frustrate readers. And lastly, but very importantly, remove any personal details of patients, such as their name, date of birth, and patient number. If you do need to include a photograph of a patient's face, note that it is no longer acceptable to just use a black bar to cover their eyes in order to protect their identity. You will still need to obtain patient consent before you can use that photograph, and be sure to submit the patient consent to the journal office together with your manuscript. This is an example of a bad pie chart. It is attempting to demonstrate what percentage of abdominal and lung infections are caused by certain types of organisms. The key on the right is too small, so it's hard to correlate it with the pieces of the pie. Not to mention that there's no indication as to what the numbers in the brackets stand for. The labeling is inconsistent in that some slices don't have the brackets while others do. It would have been better as a table. Here's an example of a good figure. The X and Y axes are clearly labeled. The scales are appropriate and the label size is appropriate. The graph is uncrowded, so it's easy to discriminate between the two data sets. And the supplementary table below the graph is simple and clear, with the columns aligning with the number of days on the x-axis. The figure legend concisely describes what the figure is about. This is an example of a good flowchart. It looks very clean and each step in the process is clearly outlined. The figure legend is concise and the small number of abbreviations used inside the figure are defined in the legend in the same order of appearance as inside the figure. This is an example of a good photograph. For photographs, high-resolution files must be provided so that its quality will be sharp on printing. By high resolution, I mean a minimum of at least 300 dpi. Each part of the figure is clearly labeled and the figure legend has a corresponding description for each part of the figure. And the stain used and magnification are also stated for each part of the figure. Here are some good general principles to follow when presenting the results of statistical analyses. Indicate the statistical tests used with all relevant parameters. When giving percentages, always provide the numerator and denominator in parentheses. Use means and standard deviations to report normally distributed data, and medians and interpercentile ranges to report skewed data. Report actual p-values. And finally, take care that you use the word significant to describe statistically significant differences only. Now we move on to the discussion part of your manuscript. Begin the discussion with the answer to the question that you posed in the introduction. This is the section that exercises your critical thinking skills as you explain the meaning and significance of your results. Never merely reiterate your results. Here, you must synthesize the meaning of your findings with those of others, clarifying your study's contribution to the field. Explain how they fit with those of other studies, extending, refuting, or confirming their findings. A large number of manuscripts are rejected because the discussion section is weak. When comparing published results with your own, do not ignore work that disagrees with yours. Confront it and convince the reader that you are correct or better, but do so in a way that does not put down the other authors. For example, in these sentences that I've shown on the slide. In your discussion, be careful not to use the following: statements that go beyond what your results can support, unspecific expressions such as higher temperature or faster rate. Use quantitative descriptions. Sudden introduction of new terms, abbreviations, methods, or results not previously mentioned anywhere in the preceding sections of your paper. Speculations on possible interpretations are allowed, but these should be rooted in fact, such as the results of your experiment, and not imagination. Finally, be prepared for the unfortunate reality that revision of the results and discussion may not just be paperwork. You may need to do further experiments. Sometimes you find that you cannot clarify your ideas in words because some items that are critical have not been studied substantially. Some work will lend themselves easily to further study, while it is impossible for others. So good study design is really the crucial first step to successful publication. Now we move on to the conclusion. Depending on the journal, the conclusion section may not have its own heading and just be the last paragraph of the discussion section, or it may be a separate heading, or it may be a separate section with its own heading. Whichever form it takes, its function is the same. It is used to show how your work advances the field of study from the present state of knowledge. It should be clear to help editors and reviewers judge your work. Provide clear justification for how your work advances the field. Indicate uses, extensions, or applications of your work as appropriate. Do not just repeat the abstract. The abstract and the conclusion serve very different purposes, although some of the same messages may be written. Do not just list the experimental results here. Trivial statements of your results are unacceptable in the conclusion. To end, suggest future experiments that are underway that build on your work, and point out experiments that might already be underway. The acknowledgement section is where you recognize those who helped in the research. Be brief. One paragraph is usually sufficient. This is where you mention those who helped in the research but are not authors, such as advisors, financial supporters or funders, writers, proofreaders, and suppliers who may have donated materials. Remember that you need to obtain their consent before you can cite their name in this section. Here is an example taken from the journal Gastroenterology. Many journals also require a conflicts of interest statement to be placed before the references section or after the abstract. What is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest occurs when objectivity is potentially compromised by a desire for financial gain, prominence, professional advancement, or a successful outcome. Now, editors strive to ensure that what is published in their journal is as balanced, objective, and evidence-based as possible. Since it is difficult to distinguish between an actual COI and a perceived COI, journals require authors to disclose all and any potential COI, publish the COI statement, and then let readers judge for themselves. Conflicts of interest may be financial or non-financial. Financial conflicts of interest include financial relationships, and here are some examples. Non-financial conflicts include personal or professional relationships, affiliations, academic competition, intellectual passion, knowledge or beliefs that might affect an author's objectivity. So in this section, provide information about any potential financial and non-financial conflicts of interest that you can think of, even if you believe that it's not important or irrelevant to the study at hand. Write it down here anyway, and the journal's editor will judge for him or herself. Brief matter-of-fact statements are fine, and here is an example taken from an article published in Clinical Therapeutics. The references are where you list the main scientific publications on which your work is based. Typically, there are more mistakes in the references than any other part of the manuscript. This causes great headaches among editors, and many are so fed up that it is not unusual to find the Journal's Guide for Authors stating that errors in the references will lead to immediate rejection of a manuscript. So great attention should be paid to this section as well as to the in-text reference citations. Check the Guide for Authors to ensure that you follow the style and format given there. This is the author's responsibility and not the editor's or the publisher's. If the references are done well, the editor will certainly notice and appreciate your effort. Be sure to check which overall reference style your target journal is using, the APA or the Vancouver style. There are also many variations within these two main styles, so you really need to check the guide for authors carefully. Check the spelling of author names, the usage of et al., the year of publication, volume, page numbers and page range, and the punctuation and formatting. Do not include too many references. Check the guide for authors, as there may be a limit to the number of references you can list for the different categories of articles. Always ensure that you have fully absorbed the material you are referencing and have not just relied on checking isolated sentences or excerpts. This will also help you to ensure that the references you do include are truly relevant and related to your work. Avoid excessive self-citations and excessive citations from a single region. You should also avoid citing articles that are published only in the local language, as these would be inaccessible to readers in other parts of the world. Avoid also personal communications, unpublished observations, and submitted manuscripts not yet published or accepted. If you must cite these types of information, then they should not be listed in the references section. Rather, they should be listed in the main body of your text, together with the full details of the people's names, their qualifications, their affiliations, the date of the personal communication, what form the communication took, and so on. Here is an example taken from an article published in the journal European Urology. I will use this to point out a few of the main issues you should pay attention to. Look at the author names that I have highlighted in yellow. The first shows 3 author names, and the second 6 author names, and the third shows 3 author names followed by et al. This journal is using the list all authors up to 6. For more than 6 authors, list the first 3 authors only, followed by et al. Rule. There are quite a few different style rules available for the number of author names, so check the target journal's guide for authors carefully to see which style your target journal is using. Do not assume that the journal is simply using the 3 author names et al. Rule. Next, look at the journal names I've highlighted in pink. Most journals will require you to use Index Medicus abbreviations for journal names, but note that one-word journal names are spelled out in full. Another thing to look out for is whether there is a full stop after the journal name. Some journals have a full stop and others, like this one, do not. Also, note whether the journal name is formatted in italics or not. In this example, the journal name is in normal font and not in italics. Next, look at the volume number that I've highlighted in orange. Does the journal list the volume number only, or does it list the volume number followed by the issue number in brackets? Look at the page numbers that I've highlighted in green. Many journals will require you to provide the page range rather than just the first page of the reference. Note whether the journal requires the page range to be abbreviated, like in this example, or non-abbreviated, like in the example that I've shown in the green box on the screen. Finally, as its name suggests, this section is for the supporting or supplementary materials. This can also have the heading of appendix. If you have lots of information of secondary importance, don't put it into the methods or the results section. Put them here. Journal space is precious and it costs money to print, so materials in this section tend to be published online only. readers have the option of viewing the material online or downloading the information to their computer. The print journal will direct readers to the online material. After you have finished writing your manuscript, don't immediately submit it to your target journal. Revision done internally is extremely important to improve your manuscript before submission. Be especially careful when proofreading the article title, abstract, and introduction. Even a small error here will lead editors and referees to conclude that the authors are likely to be careless in content as well as English, causing the paper to be rejected. Here's an actual comment from an editor. My rule of thumb is that if there are more than 6 grammatical errors in the abstract, then I won't waste my time carefully reading the rest. You will be amazed by how often the little details, such as data, conclusions, and other key points in the abstract seem to contradict information presented in the rest of the paper. So make it a habit to cross-check all the information in the abstract to the text, tables, and figures as part of your final review before submission. And remember, nothing should appear in your abstract that does not appear elsewhere in your paper. And that concludes this talk on the construction of an article and how to build up your article properly. Thank you.